The first thing I felt was the floor shaking under my feet, and the first thing I heard was Sela Marn screaming my name across the reception hall. I am Vaith Solarin, senior envoy of the Threnari Accord, and in that moment, I understood that someone in this room wanted me dead. The lights of Halvorn Station flickered once, then steadied into a dim red emergency glow. Glasses fell from tables. A server droid rolled sideways and crashed into a pillar, sparks spitting from its side. Around me, delegates from 6 different systems dropped to the floor or ran for the exits, their long robes tangled around their legs, their translators shrieking warnings in a dozen languages at once. I did not run. I could not run. My legs had locked in place, frozen by a kind of fear I had never known before. The fear that comes when you realize the universe has decided, quite suddenly, that you are not going to see tomorrow. Then a hand closed around my arm, not gently, and pulled me down behind an overturned banquet table as if I weighed nothing at all. "Stay low," said Ethan Blake. He was my bodyguard, a human, quiet, polite, almost forgettable, the kind of man who opened doors for me and refilled my water glass and said very little unless spoken to first. I had barely registered him as a person before that night. He was furniture with a heartbeat, assigned to me because Earth had recently joined the Accord, and someone, somewhere, thought it would be good politics to let a human walk 2 steps behind me at state functions. I had never once imagined I would need him. 3 armored figures came through the smoke near the eastern doors, weapons raised, moving with the confidence of people who had planned this for a long time. I recognized the markings on their shoulder plates. Agents loyal to Kale Dorn, a rival negotiator who had lost 3 trade routes to my delegation that very afternoon and had made no secret of his fury about it. I remember thinking, with strange clarity, that I was about to become a diplomatic incident rather than a diplomat. Ethan did not look afraid. That was the first strange thing. He looked at the 3 armed figures the way a person looks at weather, the way you glance up at clouds to decide whether you need an umbrella. Calm, almost bored. "Ma'am," he said, "I need you to trust me for about 30 seconds." I did not have time to answer. He was already moving. I will try to describe what I saw, though even now, months later, my mind struggles to arrange the pieces into an order that makes sense. He crossed the space between us and the nearest attacker faster than I believed a person could move without mechanical assistance. There was no dramatic shout, no announcement of intent. He simply closed the distance, and by the time the attacker understood what was happening, it was already over. The weapon was no longer in the attacker's hands. The attacker was no longer standing. The second one turned, weapon swinging toward him, and Ethan used the overturned banquet table as a shield, then as a weapon, then as nothing at all, because by the time the 3rd second had passed, he did not need it anymore. The whole exchange, from the moment he stood up to the moment all 3 intruders were on the ground and no longer a threat, lasted perhaps 12 seconds. 12 seconds. I have negotiated treaties that took 11 years. I have seen wars begin over a single insulting word choice in a trade document, and here was a man who ended a coordinated attack in less time than it takes to properly greet a stranger. He turned back to me, and his breathing had barely changed. There was no wild look in his eyes, no shaking hands, none of the things I would have expected from someone who had just done what he had done. He simply held out his hand to help me up, the same way he might have helped me out of a transport pod. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" he asked. I stared at him. I could not make words come out of my mouth for several seconds, which, for a professional diplomat, is something close to a scandal. "No," I finally managed. "I am not hurt." Security teams flooded the hall, a full 2 minutes later, shouting instructions, sealing doors, scanning for further threats. By the time they arrived, Ethan had already checked the 3 attackers, confirmed they were alive and no longer capable of causing harm, and was standing beside me again, watching the exits with the same quiet attentiveness he always had, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Sela Marn, my personal aide, reached me moments later, her 4 eyes wide with shock, her breathing ragged. She looked at Ethan the way one looks at a natural disaster that has just passed through a town and left it standing, somehow, against all reason. "What," she whispered, "was that?" I did not have an answer for her. I did not have an answer for myself either. Later that night, after the station's security council had finished their questioning, after the medics had confirmed I was unharmed, after Cale Dorn had issued a stiff and unconvincing statement denying any involvement in the attack, I found myself sitting alone in my quarters, unable to sleep. I kept replaying those 12 seconds in my mind, not the violence itself, though that had certainly shaken me, but the calm that surrounded it, the complete absence of hesitation, the way Ethan had looked at 3 armed attackers and seen, apparently, nothing more alarming than an inconvenience to be dealt with before dinner. I had read the files on Earth before accepting Ethan as my assigned protector. Every diplomat receives a briefing on any species newly admitted to the Accord, and humanity's file had been thin, almost apologetic in tone. Recently spacefaring, limited technology compared to most Accord members. A single homeworld, still mostly unexplored by the wider galaxy. The briefing had used words like developing and young, and if I am honest, I had read those words and quietly filed humans away in my mind as harmless, charming perhaps, well-mannered, not a species to be taken particularly seriously. I thought of Ethan holding doors for me. I thought of him carrying my luggage without complaint, standing silently at the edge of every meeting, never speaking unless spoken to. I thought of the 12 seconds in the banquet hall, and I began, for the first time, to wonder if I had made a serious error in judgment. The next morning, I requested his presence in my private office an hour before my scheduled meetings. He arrived exactly on time, as he always did, dressed neatly, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. "You wanted to see me, ma'am?" I studied him for a long moment before speaking. He did not fidget under my gaze, did not look away, simply waited with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to being watched. "Last night," I said carefully, "you moved faster than any bodyguard I have ever had. You disabled 3 armed attackers without hesitation, without visible fear, and without any apparent difficulty. I would like to understand how that is possible." Something flickered across his face. Not pride, not embarrassment, something closer to mild confusion, as though I had asked him to explain why water was wet. "I had training," he said simply. "Standard protective service training. Nothing unusual." "Nothing unusual," I repeated slowly. "Ethan, 3 trained combatants with weapons were disabled in under 15 seconds by one man with his bare hands. Where I come from, that would be considered extraordinary." He shrugged, an oddly casual gesture that seemed completely at odds with the danger he had walked through the night before. "Where I come from," he said, "it's Tuesday." I did not understand the reference, and my translator offered no useful context for it, but something in the way he said it settled into my mind like a stone dropped into still water. He was not exaggerating for effect. He was not being modest either. He genuinely believed that what he had done was unremarkable. I dismissed him a few minutes later, more unsettled than before our conversation had begun, and spent the rest of that morning unable to focus on the trade documents waiting on my desk. Instead, I found myself opening a private channel to the Accord's archive of species files, searching for something I had never bothered to look for before. The truth about Earth. I did not know it yet, sitting in my office with the quiet hum of Halvorn Station around me. But I was about to learn something that would change the way I understood not only Ethan Blake, but every human being who had ever left that small, distant, blue-green world behind them. For now, though, I only knew this: my bodyguard, the quiet man who refilled my water glass and said very little, had just shown me that everything I believed about his species was, in some fundamental way, wrong, and I intended to find out exactly how wrong I had been. Outside my window, Halvorn Station continued its slow orbit, indifferent to the small drama that had unfolded within it the night before. Delegates from a dozen worlds went about their business, unaware that the true story of that attack was not the failed attempt on my life, but the 12 seconds that had ended it, and the man who had made it look effortless. I closed the trade documents, opened a new search window, and began to read. The Accord archive was not designed for casual browsing. It was built for diplomats who needed quick summaries, not for anyone who wanted to dig beneath the surface. And it took me nearly an hour of searching before I found a name that seemed worth pursuing. A xenoanthropologist named Noah Bennett, listed as one of the few Accord scholars who had actually spent time studying humans on their homeworld rather than reading reports about them from a comfortable distance. I sent him a message that afternoon, brief and direct, the way diplomats are trained to write. I explained that I had recently witnessed something involving a human security officer that I did not fully understand, and I asked whether he would be willing to speak with me. I did not expect a fast reply. Scholars, in my experience, rarely respond quickly to anyone outside their own field. He answered within 20 minutes. We spoke that evening through a private channel, his face appearing on my screen with the tired, eager look of someone who had spent years waiting for anyone at all to ask him the right questions. He was human himself, though he had lived among the Accord worlds for most of his adult life, and something in his expression told me he had been hoping for this conversation for a very long time. "You said you saw one of them fight," he said, before I had even finished my introduction. "Tell me exactly what happened." I described the banquet hall, the 3 attackers, the 12 seconds. I described the calm on Ethan's face, the way his breathing had barely changed, the offhand comment about it being a Tuesday. Noah listened without interrupting, nodding slowly at certain details as though confirming something he already suspected. "That sounds about right," he said when I finished. "Actually, that sounds fairly restrained. For a human, I've seen worse, or better, depending on how you look at it." "Restrained," I repeated. "He disabled 3 armed attackers in under 15 seconds, and you are telling me that was restrained?" "Ambassador, may I ask what your briefing on Earth told you before you accepted this assignment?" I told him. Recently, spacefaring, limited technology, a single homeworld, still mostly unexplored, young species still developing. Noah laughed, though there was no real humor in it, more the tired sound of a man who had heard the same mistake made 100 times before. "That briefing isn't wrong," he said. "It's just incomplete in a way that matters enormously. Let me ask you something. Do you know what percentage of Earth's surface is considered genuinely safe for an unarmed, unprepared person to walk across without specialized survival training?" I did not know, and I told him so. "Neither do most people outside their system," he said. "The honest answer is that the number is very small. Earth is not a garden world, Ambassador. It never has been. It has enormous predatory animals on every continent, creatures capable of ending a human life in seconds, and they have been there for longer than humans have existed as a species. It has diseases that can spread through an entire population before anyone even understands what is happening. It has weather patterns that can flatten cities, freeze regions solid, or set forests ablaze across distances larger than most of the territories your own government administers. And on top of all of that, for the vast majority of their history, humans have spent an enormous amount of their time and energy trying to survive one another." I sat back in my chair, trying to absorb what he was telling me. It did not match anything in the official briefing, and I said as much. The official briefing was written by administrators who wanted a short, tidy summary of a new member species, Noah said. "It is not wrong exactly. It simply leaves out the parts that would take too long to explain and might make the other Accord members uncomfortable. The truth is that Earth has spent millions of years producing exactly one kind of survivor. Every single human being alive today, every one of them without exception, is descended from an unbroken line of ancestors who managed to survive predators, disease, disaster, and each other, long enough to have children who did the same. There is no soft version of that history. There is no branch of the family tree that took it easy. You are saying they are all dangerous by nature. I am saying they are all capable by nature in a way that most species in this accord simply are not, because most species in this accord did not need to be. Your homeworld, Ambassador, if I remember correctly from your own species file, has very few large predators, a stable climate, and a long history of cooperative governance, rather than open conflict. That is a wonderful thing. It also means that a Threnari child grows up in relative safety, without needing the same instincts a human child needs, almost from birth. I thought of my own childhood on Threnar Prime, the calm gardens, the careful supervision, the complete absence of any real physical danger, from the moment I was born until the moment I left for university. I had never once, in my entire life, been in a situation where my survival depended on my own physical capability rather than the structures and systems built around me. And Ethan, I said slowly, he grew up with none of that safety. He grew up on a world where the systems built around him were built by humans, for humans, specifically because nothing else would keep them alive. Ambassador, I do not say this to frighten you. Humans are not cruel by nature, and most of them, in my long experience with the species, would very much prefer to live peaceful, ordinary lives. But peace, for a human, is a skill they had to build on top of instincts that are far older and far harder than anything most Accord species carry within them. Your bodyguard did not train to become dangerous. He simply is, in the same way that a Threnari is naturally inclined toward patience and careful thought. It is not a costume he puts on. It is closer to the bone than that. I did not sleep well that night. I lay awake in my quarters, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Ethan standing quietly at the edge of every meeting, refilling my water glass, saying very little unless spoken to first. I thought about the calm on his face after the attack, the complete absence of panic, the way he had simply moved, and the danger had simply ended. I thought about the word Noah had used, restrained. The following day, I requested a longer meeting with him, and he agreed to send me whatever declassified material existed on Earth's history. What arrived in my inbox that afternoon was not a short document. It was an enormous archive, decades of research compiled by scholars who had studied humanity's past with the same careful attention most of the Accord reserved for far older, far more celebrated civilizations. I read about ice ages that had swept across entire continents, forcing early humans to survive temperatures that would have ended most other species within hours. I read about diseases that had claimed enormous portions of human populations within a single generation, only for the survivors to rebuild, adapt, and continue forward. I read about creatures, some long extinct, some still very much alive on modern Earth, that possessed strength and speed far beyond anything a human body could naturally match, and yet humans had not only survived alongside them, they had, over time, become the dominant species on their entire world. I read about human history in broader terms as well, the long, difficult story of a species that had spent thousands of years in conflict with itself before finally, slowly, painfully, learning to build something resembling lasting cooperation. It was not a comfortable read. There was very little softness in it, but there was something else there too, something that struck me as I made my way through page after page of difficult history. There was an unmistakable thread of persistence running through every single chapter. No matter what challenge Earth presented, humans had found a way to continue. I set the archive aside that evening and sat quietly in my office for a long time, thinking about Ethan Blake, and about how completely I had misunderstood him. He was not furniture with a heartbeat. He was not simply polite and forgettable, assigned to me as a matter of political convenience. He was the product of a world that had tried, in every possible way, to end him before he ever had the chance to grow up, and he had come through it, not only intact, but calm, gentle even, in the small daily moments I had witnessed between us. He held doors open. He asked after my comfort. He never once raised his voice or showed the slightest hint of aggression toward me or anyone on my staff. And yet, when 3 armed attackers had entered that banquet hall with the clear intention of ending my life, he had moved through them in 12 seconds without a single moment of hesitation, and afterward he had simply asked if I was hurt. I began to understand, slowly, that these two things were not in conflict with one another. They were the same thing, seen from two different angles. A species that had survived what Earth demanded of it did not need to prove anything through unnecessary aggression. The capability was simply there, quiet and constant, like a held breath, ready the moment it was needed and invisible the rest of the time. I thought of my own species' history, our gardens, our careful diplomacy, our long traditions of patient negotiation, and for the first time in my career, I felt something uncomfortably close to smallness. 3 days later, Sela Marn came to my office with an urgent message from station security. Cale Dorn had left Halvorn Station abruptly the night before, without completing his scheduled negotiations, and intelligence reports suggested he was assembling a larger force somewhere beyond the station's jurisdiction. I looked up from my desk, and my eyes went, almost without thinking, to the quiet figure standing near the door, the man who had spent the last 3 days exactly where he always stood, watching the room with patient attention, saying very little unless spoken to first. Ethan met my gaze and gave a small, calm nod, as though he had already known this moment was coming. "I'll be ready, ma'am," he said. I believed him completely, and for the first time since the attack in the banquet hall, that belief did not frighten me at all. It steadied me. Station security tightened around me over the following days. A second human officer joined our detail, a woman named Grace Lowell, quiet in the same way Ethan was quiet, watchful in the same way he was watchful. I found myself studying her too, now that I understood what I was looking at. She moved through the corridors of Halvorn Station with the same unhurried calm, the same total absence of nervous energy, and I began to wonder how many humans I had walked past in my career without ever once recognizing what I was seeing. I asked Ethan about her one evening, as we walked together toward the residential wing after a long day of tense meetings. "Is she like you?" I asked. "From the same kind of place?" "Grace grew up near mountains," he said. "Cold winters, thin air, long distances between settlements. Different kind of hard than where I grew up, but the same lesson, I suppose. You learn to pay attention, or you don't get the chance to learn much else." "And where did you grow up?" He was quiet for a moment, and I wondered if I had overstepped some boundary I did not fully understand. Humans, I had learned from Noah's research, sometimes carried their early years as private things, not because they were ashamed, but because so much of it involved loss that outsiders struggled to properly understand. "Coastal region," he finally said. "Warm most of the year. Beautiful, actually, if you saw pictures of it. Green hills, blue water. People who visited from other regions always said it looked peaceful." "Was it?" He almost smiled. Almost. "There were creatures in those waters that could take a grown man under in less time than it takes to say his name. Storms came through every year strong enough to level buildings. And when I was young, there was a period where two neighboring communities were in open conflict over water rights, which meant every child in my town learned certain skills a lot earlier than any parent would have liked, because the world outside your front door did not care how old you were before it tested you." I tried to imagine it, a childhood where danger was simply part of the background, as ordinary as weather, and found that I could not quite manage it. My own childhood had been so entirely without risk that the very concept felt foreign to me, like trying to imagine a color I had never seen. "How old were you?" I asked carefully, "when you first learned to defend yourself?" "6, he said, without hesitation, as though the question were as simple as asking his height. "My grandmother taught me. She'd survived worse than I ever had to, growing up during a period when resources were even more scarce than they were by the time I came along. She used to say that gentleness was a privilege you had to earn the right to practice, and the only way to earn it was to make sure you were never caught without an answer when the world asked you a hard question." I sat with that thought for a long moment as we continued walking. Gentleness as something earned, rather than something given freely by a safe and generous world. It was such a foreign idea to me that I found myself turning it over again and again, trying to understand it from every angle. "You do not seem angry about any of it," I said eventually. The danger, the hardship, you speak of it almost fondly. It's not that I don't understand how hard it was, he said. I do. I lost people I loved to things that should never have taken them. But anger doesn't really help you survive a place like that, Ambassador. Anger makes you careless, and careless people don't usually get old. What helps is staying calm, staying aware, and doing what needs to be done without wasting energy feeling sorry for yourself about it. My grandmother used to say that the world doesn't owe you an easy life, and once you stop expecting one, everything gets a little simpler. I thought of the 12 seconds in the banquet hall, the complete absence of panic on his face, the offhand comment about it being a Tuesday. I understood it now in a way I had not before. It was not that he did not feel fear, it was that fear, for him, had been trained into something useful a long time ago, something that sharpened his attention rather than freezing his limbs the way it had frozen mine. Over the following week, as tensions with Kale Dorn continued to build and intelligence reports grew increasingly concerning, I found myself spending more time in conversation with both Ethan and Grace than I had with any of my own staff. I learned that Grace had grown up hunting for much of her family's food as a child, tracking animals through terrain that could kill an inexperienced traveler through cold alone. I learned that Ethan had spent several years, before joining protective services, working in what he called disaster response, traveling to regions of Earth devastated by storms, fires, and floods, helping to recover survivors from conditions that would have overwhelmed most rescue teams from any other Accord world. We don't really think about it as unusual, Grace told me one afternoon when I asked her the same question I had asked Ethan, about whether she resented the hardships of her upbringing. It's just what growing up looked like. I think that's the part people from other systems have the hardest time understanding. It's not that we're braver than anyone else, or tougher, or whatever word people want to use. It's that we didn't have a choice about the world we were born into, so we adapted to it, the same way any living thing adapts to its environment. The difference is just that our environment happened to ask a lot more of us than most. I began to understand, slowly and with a kind of humility I had rarely felt in my long diplomatic career, that humanity's admission into the Accord had been treated, by every official document I had encountered, as an act of charity on the part of more advanced species welcoming a younger one into the fold. Nothing in the official record suggested otherwise, and yet here I was, protected by two people whose ordinary childhoods had prepared them for dangers that most Accord citizens would never encounter in their entire lives, danger that they carried so lightly it barely registered to them as remarkable. I brought this observation to Noah Bennett during our next conversation, and he nodded slowly, as though he had been waiting for me to arrive at exactly this conclusion. "It's a strange kind of humility, isn't it?" he said. "Most species that gain access to the wider galaxy do so because they've achieved some remarkable technological or cultural milestone that puts them roughly on par with their new neighbors. Humans gained access almost by accident, relatively speaking, and they arrived with a level of physical and psychological resilience that most other species took millions of years of far gentler evolution to never actually need. The wider galaxy looked at their technology, which is admittedly still catching up in many areas, and concluded they were a young, developing species that needed careful guidance. Very few people bothered to look past the technology at what was actually walking around inside those technological limitations. Do the other Accord members know? I asked. The full truth of it? Some do. Most choose not to think about it too carefully, if I'm honest. It's a slightly uncomfortable thing to sit with, the idea that a species everyone has been quietly patronizing for the better part of a decade could, without exaggeration, handle themselves in almost any physical confrontation the galaxy might present. It's easier to keep thinking of them as the polite, eager newcomers who open doors and refill water glasses. I flinched slightly at that last detail, recognizing my own earlier description of Ethan reflected back at me, and Noah, watching my expression, offered a small, understanding smile. "You're not the first diplomat to make that mistake, Ambassador, and you won't be the last. It's a very natural thing to do. Humans, for the most part, want to be seen as approachable and kind, and they generally succeed at that. The difficulty is that approachable and kind does not mean harmless, and I think the galaxy is going to spend the next several decades slowly relearning that particular lesson. Banquet. That evening, I sat alone in my quarters once again, but this time, instead of anxiety, I felt something closer to quiet awe. I thought about the long, difficult history I had read in Noah's archive. I thought about Ethan's grandmother, teaching a 6-year-old child to defend himself because gentleness was a privilege that had to be earned. I thought about Grace tracking animals through freezing terrain as a girl, and Ethan pulling survivors from the wreckage of storms that had leveled entire towns. I thought, too, about the way both of them still managed, after everything their world had asked of them, to remain patient, courteous, and calm in every interaction I had witnessed. There was no bitterness in either of them, no chip carried on the shoulder, no need to prove anything to anyone. They simply were what their world had made them, and they carried it with a quiet dignity that I found myself admiring more with each passing day. Late that night, station security forwarded an urgent report to my office. Kale Dorn's forces had been tracked moving toward Halvorn Station, a much larger contingent than the one that had attempted to end my life in the banquet hall, equipped with weapons and numbers that suggested this time he did not intend to fail. I read the report twice, my hands trembling slightly as I set it down on my desk, and then I called for Ethan. He arrived within minutes, Grace close behind him, both of them already dressed for action, as though some part of them had been expecting this call before it ever came. "We saw the report," Ethan said, before I could speak. "We'll handle it, ma'am." I looked at him, this quiet, polite man who had once seemed to me like nothing more than pleasant furniture, assigned by a distant bureaucracy, and I understood, finally and completely, exactly what kind of person had been standing 2 steps behind me all along. "I believe you," I said, and for the first time since the attack in the banquet hall, I found that I meant it without a single trace of doubt. The attack came 2 nights later, during the closing ceremony of the Trade Summit, in the largest gathering hall on Halvorn Station. I had argued against attending, given the intelligence reports, but the station's governing council insisted that canceling the ceremony would be seen as a victory for Kale Dorn, a sign that intimidation had worked. I agreed, reluctantly, on the condition that security be doubled and that Ethan and Grace remain within arm's reach of me for the entire evening. The hall was full when it happened. Delegates and dignitaries from every corner of the Accord gathered beneath the high-domed ceiling, the soft golden light of 100 floating lanterns reflecting off polished floors. I remember thinking, in the moments before everything changed, that it was one of the most beautiful rooms I had ever stood in. The first sign of trouble was not an alarm or a shout. It was Ethan's posture, shifting almost imperceptibly beside me, his attention sharpening toward the northern entrance a full 3 seconds before anything visible happened there. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "we need to move." I did not question him. By then, I had learned better than to question him. The doors at the northern entrance failed a moment later, not through force, but through something more deliberate, some kind of override that suggested Kale Dorn's people had spent considerable time and resources preparing for exactly this moment. Armed figures poured into the hall, far more than the 3 who had attacked me in the banquet hall weeks earlier, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested extensive planning and real confidence in their numbers. Panic spread through the crowd instantly, delegates scattering in every direction, security teams shouting instructions that were quickly lost in the chaos. I felt Grace's hand on my shoulder, guiding me firmly toward a service corridor along the eastern wall, while Ethan positioned himself between us and the advancing attackers. "Go with Grace," he said. "I'll clear a path. Ethan, there are at least a dozen of them. I've handled worse odds in a bad storm season," he said, and there was no bravado in his voice at all. Only the same calm certainty I had come to recognize as entirely genuine. "Go." Grace pulled me toward the service corridor, and as we moved, I looked back just once, unable to stop myself, and saw Ethan step forward, to meet the first wave of attackers alone. What I witnessed in the moments that followed was unlike anything I had seen in my long life, unlike anything the official briefings on Earth had ever suggested I might encounter. He did not fight the way I imagined fighting to be, wild and desperate and chaotic. He fought the way water moves around stone, efficient and purposeful, never wasting a single motion, always exactly where he needed to be a fraction of a second before it mattered. He used the space around him, the furniture, the doorways, the very geometry of the hall itself, turning every obstacle into an advantage. Attackers who came at him in pairs found themselves somehow working against each other instead of him. Weapons that should have ended the confrontation in an instant never quite found their mark, because he was already somewhere else by the time they fired. It was not chaos, it was the opposite of chaos. It was a kind of terrible, focused order, and I found myself unable to look away even as Grace continued pulling me towards safety, even as my own instincts screamed at me to run and never look back. We reached the service corridor, and Grace positioned herself at the entrance, weapon drawn, watching for any threat that might follow us, while I caught my breath against the cool metal wall. Through the open doorway I could still see fragments of the hall beyond, the shifting shapes of the fight still unfolding, and I realized, with a strange mixture of horror and relief, that the number of attackers still standing had already dropped by more than half. "He's alone out there," I said to Grace, my voice unsteady. "Shouldn't you be helping him?" Grace glanced at me, and there was something almost gentle in her expression, the same patient calm I had come to associate with both of them. "He doesn't need help, ma'am," she said. "He needs someone watching this door so nobody comes through it and reaches you. That's my job right now. His job is out there, and trust me, he's better at his job than almost anyone I've ever worked with." I did not fully believe her, not in that moment, not with the sounds of struggle still echoing through the open doorway. But I stayed where I was, trusting the two of them the way I had learned to trust them over the past several weeks, and I waited. The sounds from the hall gradually changed. The shouting grew less frequent. The clash of bodies and weapons grew quieter, more sporadic, until finally, after what felt like a very long time but was, according to the station's own security logs recovered later, closer to 90 seconds, the hall fell almost entirely silent. Ethan appeared in the doorway a moment later. His uniform was torn in several places, a shallow cut visible along one cheekbone, but he was standing, breathing steadily, his expression as calm as it had been at the start of the evening. "It's clear," he said. "All 12 accounted for. None of them are going anywhere for a while." I stared at him, taking in the sight of him, unable to reconcile the gentle, quiet man who refilled my water glass with the figure who had just single-handedly ended an attack that should have, by any reasonable measure, overwhelmed him completely. 12, I repeated. "You handled 12 of them. Alone. Fewer than that, really," he said, almost apologetically, as though correcting an exaggeration in my favor rather than accepting a compliment. "A few of them turned on each other, once things got confusing. I just had to make sure the confusion kept going in the right direction." Station security arrived moments later, flooding the hall with the same chaotic urgency they had shown after the first attack, though this time there was considerably more for them to clean up. Cale Dorn himself was found among the attackers, having apparently decided to oversee the operation personally, confident enough in his numbers that he had not anticipated needing to flee. He was taken into custody without further incident, his expression, according to the officers who restrained him, one of complete disbelief. I was escorted to a secure medical suite for examination, though I insisted, over the objections of the attending physician, that Ethan be checked first. He waved off the suggestion entirely, claiming his injury was nothing more than a minor scratch, though I noticed the physician's scanner readings suggested a level of physical resilience that made even the medical staff pause and glance at one another with quiet astonishment. Later that night, once the station had finally settled back into something resembling calm, I found Ethan standing alone near a viewing window in the residential wing, looking out at the slow, silent turn of the stars beyond the station's hull. Grace had gone to file her report, The corridor around us was empty and quiet. "You saved my life twice now," I said, approaching him carefully, "in the span of a few weeks." "That's the job, ma'am." "It is more than a job, Ethan. I have had many bodyguards over the course of my career. None of them have ever done what you did tonight." He was quiet for a long moment, still looking out at the stars, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something I had not heard from him before, something almost vulnerable beneath the usual calm. "Can I tell you something, Ambassador? Something I don't say very often?" "Please." "Out there tonight, with 12 armed people trying to end this evening badly for both of us, I wasn't scared. Not really. It's strange to admit that out loud, because I know how it sounds. But where I grew up, that kind of danger was just Tuesday, like I told you before. What actually scares me is standing in rooms like this one, at these summits, surrounded by people from 100 different worlds, who are all smarter than me about things I'll never fully understand. Treaties and history and politics I never got the chance to study properly growing up. That's the part that keeps me up at night, not the fighting." I looked at him for a long moment, this quiet, remarkable man who had just calmly dismantled a coordinated assault by a dozen armed attackers, confessing that his true fear was feeling out of place in a conversation about trade policy. "Ethan," I said gently, "I think you may have the two entirely backwards. Any diplomat in this accord could learn treaty law given enough time and patience. What you did tonight cannot be taught in any classroom I have ever heard of. It is earned, the way your grandmother told you gentleness must be earned, through a lifetime of surviving things the rest of us can barely imagine." He glanced at me then, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something shift in his expression, something like quiet surprise, as though no one had ever framed it to him in quite those terms before. "I've never really thought about it that way," he admitted. "Perhaps it is time someone did," I said, "because I intend to make sure the rest of this accord starts thinking about it that way as well." Outside the window, Halvorn Station continued its slow, steady orbit, and somewhere below us, in a secure holding facility, Cale Dorn sat with the wreckage of his ambitions, having learned, far too late, exactly what kind of person he had chosen to underestimate. In the days that followed, news of what had happened in the gathering hall spread quickly across Halvorn Station, and, soon after, through diplomatic channels reaching far beyond it. The official reports focused on Cale Dorn's arrest, on the treaty violations, on the political consequences he now faced before the Accord Council. But among the delegates and security staff who had actually witnessed the aftermath, a different story circulated in quieter conversations, one that had far less to do with politics and far more to do with a single human man who had faced 12 armed attackers alone and walked away with nothing more than a shallow cut on his cheek. I noticed the change almost immediately. Delegates who had previously spoken to me with the polite condescension often reserved for representatives of newer, less established Accord members began addressing my staff, and Ethan in particular, with a new and careful respect. Security teams from other delegations began requesting information about human protective service training, questions that had never once come up in all my years of attending these summits. Even Sela Marn, who had screamed my name in terror on the night of the first attack, now watched Ethan with something closer to fascination than fear. I found the shift both satisfying and slightly troubling. Satisfying because I had come to believe, over the past several weeks, that humanity deserved far more respect than the wider galaxy had been willing to offer them. Troubling because I worried that this new attention might reduce Ethan and Grace to something like curiosities, exotic specimens to be studied and discussed rather than people to be understood. I raised this concern with Noah Bennett during what had become our regular evening conversations, and he nodded slowly, clearly having considered the same worry many times before. "It's the danger that comes with finally being noticed," he said. "For years, most of the galaxy either ignored humans entirely or treated them as a charming curiosity, harmless, and a little behind the times. Now that people have seen what they're actually capable of, there's a real risk of swinging too far in the other direction, turning them into something feared rather than respected. Neither extreme does them justice. Then what does? I asked. What would justice actually look like for a species so consistently misunderstood? Noah considered the question carefully before answering. I think it looks like exactly what you're doing right now, Ambassador, taking the time to actually know them, not as a symbol of anything, not as proof of some larger point about their species, but simply as the individuals they are. Ethan Blake is not humanity. He's one man, shaped by a particular childhood on a particular stretch of coastline, who happens to be very good at his job, and from everything I've heard, quite kind in the ordinary moments as well. Grace Lowell is not humanity either. She's her own person, with her own history and her own reasons for choosing this work. The mistake the wider galaxy has always made with newly admitted species is assuming that understanding one representative means understanding the whole. I'd encourage you not to make that same mistake in the opposite direction. I took his words seriously, and over the following weeks, as my duties on Halvorn Station gradually returned to something resembling routine, I made a point of continuing my conversations with both Ethan and Grace, not as a diplomat gathering research on a fascinating new species, but simply as a person getting to know two colleagues who had, through circumstances neither of us had chosen, become important to me. I learned that Ethan had a sister back on Earth, younger than him, who had chosen a much quieter life running a small business in the same coastal town where they had both grown up. He spoke of her with obvious affection, and I noticed that his voice softened in a way I had not heard before whenever her name came up. I learned that Grace had a habit of sketching the landscapes of every new world she visited, filling notebook after notebook with quick, careful drawings that she kept entirely to herself, embarrassed by the idea of anyone else seeing them. I learned, too, that both of them carried a quiet homesickness beneath their calm, professional exteriors, a longing for a world that had asked so much of them and yet remained, in some undeniable way, the only place either of them had ever truly felt was theirs. "Do you ever think about going back?" I asked Ethan one evening, several weeks after the attack in the gathering hall, as we walked together along one of the station's long observation decks. "All the time," he admitted. "It's strange, actually. People hear about Earth, about everything Noah's research probably told you, and they assume we'd all want to leave the moment we got the chance. But it's home. Difficult, sometimes dangerous, but home. There's a particular quality to the light there, in the evenings, over the water where I grew up, that I haven't found anywhere else I've traveled. I miss that more than I probably should admit." "Perhaps," I said, "once your current assignment concludes, you might consider taking some time to visit." He glanced at me, a small, genuine smile crossing his face, the first I had seen from him that seemed entirely unguarded. "Would you release me from my duties that easily, Ambassador?" "I would release you for a visit," I said. "Not permanently. I have grown rather accustomed to having you 2 steps behind me at state functions." He laughed at that, a quiet, easy sound, and for a moment, standing together on that observation deck with the stars turning slowly beyond the glass, the distance between our 2 very different worlds felt smaller than it ever had before. The final trade summit before my scheduled return to Threnar Prime took place a month later, and this time there were no incidents, no attacks, no moments of chaos disrupting the careful choreography of interstellar diplomacy. Cale Dorn's removal from his position had sent a clear message throughout the region, and whatever ambitions remained among his former allies seemed to have been thoroughly discouraged by the outcome of his attempt against me. At the closing ceremony, held once again in the same gathering hall where Ethan had faced down 12 armed attackers, I stood before the assembled delegates to deliver my final remarks on the successful conclusion of our trade negotiations. I had prepared careful, measured language, the kind of diplomatic phrasing that had served me well throughout my career, and I intended to deliver exactly that speech, focused entirely on the treaty terms and the future cooperation between our various systems. Instead, as I looked out over the crowd and found Ethan and Grace standing quietly near the entrance, exactly where they always stood, I found myself setting my prepared remarks aside. "Before I conclude," I said, I would like to say something that falls outside the scope of tonight's official business." The hall grew quiet, delegates exchanging curious glances, unsure what to expect. "Several months ago," I continued, "I arrived at this summit with a security detail I privately considered, if I am honest, something of a formality. Humanity's admission into this accord is recent. Their technology remains, in many respects, still developing. I had read the briefings, and I had drawn the conclusions those briefings seemed to invite, that humans were a young species, harmless and well-meaning, more in need of our protection and guidance than capable of offering protection themselves." I paused, letting the words settle over the room. I was wrong, profoundly, embarrassingly wrong, in a way that I suspect many of you seated here tonight have also been wrong, whether you have realized it yet or not. Twice during my time at this station, I would not be standing before you tonight were it not for the actions of my human bodyguard, a man who faced overwhelming odds without hesitation, without complaint, and without ever once asking for recognition in return. I have since learned that his calm in the face of danger was not extraordinary by the standards of his own people. It was, in his own words, simply Tuesday. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the hall at that, though I noted it carried more warmth than mockery. "I share this, not to frighten anyone in this room," I continued, "nor to suggest that our newest Accord members should be regarded with anything other than the same respect and partnership we extend to one another. I share it because I believe we have, collectively, made the mistake of underestimating a people who deserve far better from us. Earth is not a gentle world, it never has been, and yet the people who have come from it, in my direct experience, are among the most patient, courteous, and quietly capable individuals I have had the privilege of working alongside. I would ask each of you, as you continue to build relationships with our human colleagues in the months and years ahead, to extend to them the full respect their history and their character have earned, rather than the polite condescension too many of us, myself included, have offered instead." I looked toward the back of the hall as I finished speaking, and found Ethan watching me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something quiet, and moved beneath the usual calm, and beside him, Grace wiped quickly at her eyes before anyone else could notice. The applause that followed was not the polite, obligatory sound diplomats offer one another at the conclusion of a routine speech. It was genuine, sustained, delegates from across a dozen worlds rising from their seats, and I found, to my own surprise, that my own eyes had grown unexpectedly damp as well. In the weeks that followed my departure from Halvorn Station, I formally requested that Ethan Blake and Grace Lowell be assigned to my personal detail for all future diplomatic postings, a request the Accord's Protective Services Division approved without hesitation, given the events of the past several months. Both of them accepted, though Ethan, true to form, insisted on first taking the visit home I had promised him, spending 3 quiet weeks along that coastline he had described to me with such quiet affection, walking the same shores his grandmother had once walked, watching the particular quality of evening light he had said he could not find anywhere else in the galaxy. He returned with a small gift for me, something I had not expected and did not know quite how to categorize within any diplomatic protocol I had ever studied. It was a simple stone, smooth and gray, worn soft by years of tide and current, the kind of thing a child might pick up along a beach without a second thought. "It's not much," he said, somewhat awkwardly, as he handed it to me. "But where I grew up, we used to say that a stone from home carries a piece of the place with it, wherever it goes. I thought you might like to have one, given everything." I held the stone in my palm for a long moment, feeling its smooth, unremarkable weight, and thought of everything it represented, a world that had asked more of its people than any other I had encountered, a history written not in comfort but in persistence, a quiet, patient man who had once seemed to me like nothing more than pleasant furniture, and who I now understood to be one of the most remarkable individuals I had ever had the honor of knowing. "Thank you, Ethan," I said. "I will keep it close," and I have, in the years since, carried that small gray stone with me to every posting, every negotiation, every new world I have visited in my continuing career as a diplomat of the Threnari Accord. It sits now on my desk as I record these final thoughts, a quiet reminder of the lesson Halvorn Station taught me, one I have carried with me ever since, and have tried, in every interaction since, to honor properly. We are so quick, in this vast and crowded galaxy, to measure a people by the technology they carry, by the ships they fly, by the treaties they can offer at a negotiating table. We are so slow, so often, to look past those surface measurements at the far deeper question of what a people have survived to become who they are. Earth gave humanity very little in the way of comfort. It gave them, instead, something far rarer and far more valuable, a depth of quiet strength that no amount of advanced technology can manufacture, and no gentle, easy world could ever have produced. I did not know, when I first accepted Ethan Blake as my assigned bodyguard, that I was standing beside a survivor of one of the harshest worlds in the known galaxy. I knew only a quiet, polite man who refilled my water glass and said very little unless spoken to first. I understand now that those two things were never in conflict with one another. They were, all along, simply two sides of the very same person, and I count myself fortunate, beyond anything I can properly express, to have finally learned to see them both.